as an artist living in a post-conflict state, would create art exclusively with message of unity and inspiration, rather than exclusively create art depicting previous or ongoing suffering. You can now start with the Honorable Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
You are audible and visible, yes.
Okay. Hold on. My Zoom is buggy. Right. Okay. So I prefer verbal POIs, preferably 5th minute onwards. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Right. 3 things I'm going to do in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to provide to you the most important framing. Secondly, then, substantives as to why it's important. And lastly, a bit of comparatives, like no matter if opposition hasn't come out yet, as to why then, in whatever case, OG still takes this debate. Let's begin with number 1, framing. What's the most important framing this debate? I think it's clear, right? This framing of this debate is that we exist in a post-conflict society. Therefore, the simple substantive that needs to come out here is how does it look like then within the post-conflict society? We realize that post-conflict societies are oftentimes, can look in multiple different ways, but oftentimes governments from multiple past antagonistic parties forming a party or forming a government. Communities trying to reconcile with one another. These are individuals in the process of unlearning past grievances. Therefore, the next step in a post-conflict society should be always about going beyond past grievances. Why is it then that it's important that the message is about unity and peace? First, substantive. It is important that art depicts the idea of unity and peace, because unity and peace is in line with what you should promote in the post-conflict state. Because the concept allows for the promotion of togetherness, working together to get beyond the pain. It's likely to include depictions of both sides working together, depicting racial harmony, like having, kumbaya things, right? It's extrememely important because we need to then contrast with what it looks like with depicting previous ongoing sufferings. And here's where I immediately draw the comparative, right? Because I think the problem with depicting previous ongoing sufferings is how it necessarily forces individuals to relive the shitty experience. It's very insensitive to people who are traumatized. These are individuals who want to go beyond the pain of having racial conflict or like genocide, whatever like past problems that exist. You have to realize that the trauma is oftentimes still fresh. These are traumas that people face that are extremely real and peripheral to them, right? This depicting of past conflicts is oftentimes just reopening wounds. It's allowing people to look into what were the problems they faced, like the family members that they died, and these are real and horrific depictions that exist. What is the alternative that we provide to you, right? We tell you that unity and peace allows for individuals to then, like, firstly, have a counter narrative to the past depictions of pain. We tell you that maybe it's time we should work together. Maybe it's time we should look towards how, as a community from multiple different backgrounds, from potentially antagonistic living, could potentially get better, how our society and community would potentially look like. It sends message of a brighter future, of how the future should look like between different races, different like communities, and how trauma is a small part of life that we should then move on beyond, right? I think this does 2 things. Number 1, in comparison, it pushes a stronger narrative in society that look, there is ability for us to grow beyond the pain. But number 2, it allows for positive messaging to exist. This positive messaging is extremely important, noting that in a world where like every other thing is depressing, every other conflict that you face is already problematic, you probably don't want to relive that shitty experience. That's when you're able to have a counter narrative to that, right? We think that the depiction of previous ongoing sufferings already exists fresh in people's mind. This is something that already, they think about it all the time, right? So why then should the art depict that very same thing when people are going through that same pain, are going through that same trauma? We think this positive messaging allows for you to then heal yourself from those things. Yeah. Right, cool. That's substantive here, which I think is extremely important. I think it's more because obviously this debate is an actor debate, and here's where OG is going to tie in the actor into this debate. Because we believe that as an artist, it's about making your art, it's about your art making the most impact to the largest group of people that you can. And here's why Unity and Peace does that best. We believe that as an artist in itself, you're more likely to face economic pressure. You're more likely to, also need to make money. You also need to eat, right? So you're more like, the comparison here is that you're more likely to face resistance when you sell ideas or art depicting previous ongoing sufferings. Here's the reason why. As said earlier, right, a lot of the reasons people don't want to consume previous ongoing suffering is because it's something that they relive in their heads all the time. So it's more likely than not, this is something that's not accepted by society. It's something that communities don't want to look at. Or at the very least, moderates and people on the fence would probably not want to consume this type of media. The message of unity and peace is more receptive to a bigger market. It's easier to sell the idea to a larger group of individuals, especially when we classify these individuals as people who are like, parents who want their kids to grow up with positive messages and generationally move on beyond those conflicts. Or just people on the fence in general, people who are tired of conflict, people who want to forget about the past pains of conflict. But secondly, it's a larger community that can consume this because you're not limited to purely individuals who face your same levels of suffering, your same levels of conflict. We think that the community in general oftentimes react better to positive messaging and react better to that. Therefore, you're able to sell to the market. What does then mean for you? This means that you gain the first mover advantage, especially in a post-conflict society that wants to move beyond that. You'll probably be one of the early artists that portrays a brighter future for the state. And it's more likely that people consume your art first in comparison to depicting very sad and depressing imagery, right? We think that's when you're able to push even further, get a first mover's advantage here. That's how you portray and advance your career as an artist even further. But before I move on, I'll take one POI from closing.
So just to be sure, your stance is that you're against art that makes people uncomfortable.
Yep, that's exactly it. We're not completely against art that makes people uncomfortable, but we're saying that that art only compounds how people feel, right? Compounds how shitty people already feel anyway. So why should you compound a negative feeling where you should instead look towards creating alternative, right? Create an antithesis to how shitty experiences are. You want to make people feel happier. You want to make people feel there's a brighter future out there. I think being nihilistic in situations of post-conflict situations are bad. Cool. Last comparative, right? What's the most important part here that we point to you? We point out to you two things. That number one, the framing is extremely important. That in a post-conflict society where your environment is shitty, you need to make it better. But number two, we point to you that even in the context of an artist, there's always opportunity for you to grow the moment in time you choose the strategic method in which you want to push your art. And we think that unity and inspiration is the best way forward as an artist in itself and as towards society in general. We think at the very least, what OG provides to you is an antithesis to the shitty situation. I think opposition needs to bear the burden and push to us why, in an already shitty situation, you should continue to depict more harmful imagery, more problematic imagery. For that, OG takes his debate.
We thank the Prime Minister for that wonderful speech. We can now start with LO. You're here.
Hello, can I be heard? And just a second. Am I also visible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Okay, cool. Give me 10 seconds. POI is exclusively through the chat, please. I will try to take the closing. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I want to note that there's a difference between forgetting and moving on. Forgetting doesn't mean that you can't move on, and neither does wanting to move on means that you necessarily want to forget the trauma and the lived experiences that you had specifically while suffering. From opposition, we're going to prove to you why this artist would rather prefer to depict the suffering and the pain that people had went through, and why that probably works in their favor in terms of engaging with the government on creating the most impact on people. It's true that people went through a lot of suffering. It's true that their emotions are really recent. It's true that they probably want to move on, but it's not true that they want to forget, because the government is already making attempts to do that. The post-conflict governments in most of these instances want to create some sort of order through that chaos, want to create some form of functional government. And the only way that they try to achieve that is to try to reduce the kind of conflicts that exist between people. Because it's likely that they went into post-conflict because of some regional tensions or like religious issues or political issues, or maybe like even some racial or ethnic issues, which means that when there's ruins of this post-conflict government, it's likely, like, again, trigger warning, trauma and like ethnic cleansing. If it was ethnic cleansing, that there's probably still people that like are fearing for their lives because they're the next minority and fear living with that majority. There's people that, like, because of religious tensions, still feel like they may be targeted in the new and upcoming government. They want to make sure that they're respected and that there is not an erasure of their identity. Why is this likely to happen? Because governments want to create this unity, and this unity necessarily comes from creating a overall broadening factor, which means to create an identity that both these, like multiple of these groups, can encompass. Insofar as there's conflict that existed in these spaces, there's less likely to be a denominator that like ties all of these communities together beyond just this push coming from the government that we want to create unity, so we're less likely to fall in conflict. Beyond just saying that you're all humans and you should be together, there isn't so much to like bring these people together because they literally were in conflict before all of this like thing started to happen, right? Which then means that governments are already attempting to sort of reduce that kind of chaos, reduce that kind of conflict, and want to create burdens of like pushing unity on people. They want to push on people that it's their burden after all of this conflict to come together and live together in harmony, no matter what their lived experiences were, which means they're generally going to create some form of erasure in terms of their identities and their past lived experiences, because they don't want people to fucking hate their oppressors. They don't want people to like go and like claim for things like, oh, maybe we want some reparations. These are things that are harder for governments of post-conflict societies in general to do, because they're trying to pick up the rumbles from like sort of chaos and all of these things, which then means that the counter narrative that government talks about is merely escapism. The true counter narrative is to counter the biggest and majoritarian narrative that exists. The majoritarian narrative and the biggest push coming from the government is that everyone should live in unity and harmony, and people should just forget and move on from the kind of grievances that they had to go through during the situation of conflict, which then means that the biggest counter narrative is to talk about the pain and suffering, because the governments are attempting to erase and make sure people forget that. Why is this likely like then a good thing, right? First things, I want you to note the artist's interest. And it's not just about making the most impact, but it's also about forms of expression. The form of expression that come through unity and all. And note, this is a post-conflict state that might still be going through ongoing suffering, or it could have like had it in the past. The problem with this is that if it's an ongoing suffering, things like unity and things like wanting to have a better life are still very utopic and also far-fetched. They also seem things that just haven't really happened. So yeah, sure, you'll have to use your creative imagination and all these kinds of things, but they're also probably painful for you to do. In a point of suffering and all of these things, when you can't specifically imagine how you generally have unity, some of these instances can be forced for you, specifically when you're an artist that probably is going through that suffering, and that kind of catharsis doesn't exist outside government. The second situation here is to note, like, what if this is something in the past? The problem with this is that there is issues with like who writes the history. Generally, winners and victorious people tend to write the history, which means that there is significant more amount of erasure in terms of what specifically happened and all of these lived experiences. While it's also true that people don't specifically want to go through trauma, I'm telling you that this is not a person that's like an outside person, like a third person or an artist that didn't live through these experiences. This is likely to be an artist because they've lived through this post-conflict society. They're likely to be one that witnessed these experiences firsthand or secondhand. So they're not some privileged fucker telling these people that, hey, go through your emotional pain and suffering again for me because I want to make money out of it. That's not the case. It's unlikely to be insensitive. It's likely to be catharsis in nature. So what's the second thing here in terms of why does this still make the most level of impact? Note what's important here, right? When specifically people are noticing that the government is constantly trying to tell them to move on, the process of moving on isn't just forgetting about what happened, but it's also about coming to face and reality with what specifically happened. I think the way that artists go ahead and depict the depth of emotions of human suffering and sadness has been witnessed in the past in the ways that people try to show the suffering of like losing someone, the way that people try to show the suffering of not being able to figure out what your identity is. All these are grave human sufferings and like loss of someone that like rely on like intense emotions of like human sadness, is to show the viscerality of these emotions and to allow people to process these emotions in a far better way. I'll take that POI from CG real quick.
If the government is trying to erase lived experiences, they will censor the art of this particular artist. The debate doesn't take place in this context.
Sorry, I couldn't catch you. Could you repeat that?
If the government is trying to erase lived experiences, they will just censor the art of this particular artist. The debate doesn't take place in this context.
Yeah, I think it's probably true that they might want to censor this artist, but that's exactly still what is going to bring discourse about, because if governments are so oppressive that they can't even witness like artists probably trying to talk about pain and suffering, it probably means it's so visceral that they want to cause like these erasures even more. So all of the analysis that I gave you about wanting to create this erasure and not wanting people to acknowledge that they went through pain and suffering, so governments have lesser burden to try to like probably reparate their experiences and sort of compensate them, it then means that all that impact means so much more, and why then it's more important rather the artist goes and does this. But the problem of censorship is probably like not like, even if that happens, it creates that amount of discourse in terms of people wanting to know what specifically happened, and there's more uproar. So even if this artist gets censored, at least they got to create the art, and then there's discourse around it, so that's still a good thing. But like the more bigger impact is also in terms of what's significant to people. When the rest of the government and when the rest of the people around them are already telling these form of things, then it's not just about escapism, but it's also about creating this unique way where people get to experience all of these things in terms of you talking about their lived experiences and you sharing these lived experiences with them. With all of that said, couldn't be more proud to oppose.
We think LO for that speech. Now to conclude OG's case, let's have DPM. You're here.
Hello, let me just set up my timer. I'll take my PO in the chat, probably from closing opposition for engagement purposes, at the 5th minute. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. First, framing relative to the material and opening opposition we just heard. 2, additional responses to the opposition case line. 3, explanations of why we are debate winning. So first, framing. What we suggest is that the implications of this being a post-conflict society provides important considerations for you as an artist, and I want you to note 4 things about the artist and the society that they likely live in. The first is that it is a post-conflict society, and you as an artist know the conflict has ended because your communities had already have significant attempts to reconcile their differences, since they've realized what we need to do is stop talking about the conflict from biased perspectives on either side, therefore form reconciliation communities because they are tired of killing each other. They are tired of suffering every single day. And the reason you know this is because this peace and conflict reconciliation is likely to be communicated to the members of your society to ensure that people know that we are no longer in conflict, both to let your domestic populations know that they can come outside now, that they can do business and go about their day-to-day lives, that their kids can go to school, that they can develop their state. Secondarily, that you want to let the world know that you are in harmony, therefore are not a risk to cooperate with and form investments, etc., etc. But second is that opposition, importantly, cannot guarantee that you are on the good side of history. That is, they cannot say that you are definitely part of the community of the victims of the injustice under their side of the house. The motion doesn't phrase you as this minority, and you as judges ought to interpret the artist being on either side of the potential oppressor or potential victim of this particular conflict. This means when you judge this debate, you need to support both a potential oppressor or potential victim of the conflict depicting art in either unity, peace, and inspiration under our side of the house, and a biased representation of the conflict that was horrible under their side of the house, which could include oppressing art, like artists that come from the oppressive groups pushing art that is harmful towards the minority group within that situation. But third is that you know the people around you have been affected by this conflict. Therefore, people are inherently traumatized about this conflict due to things like deaths and constant infighting prior, which means that you as an artist feel an inclination to make the people around you feel better, since it will be the natural inclination for people to look for art in ways that distract themselves from these particular sufferings rather than indulge in those sufferings. But lastly, I think that what OO says is true, right? Like, Fact checkers exist, people who write down histories exist, and both parties in the conflict have people who have experienced loss and sufferings and are going to be people that are going to talk to historians, that will be interviewed by scholars who then establish a timeline of what has happened, which means in the future there is more room to talk about the conflict in more nuanced ways. What we suggest uniquely is that you cannot depict biased versions of the art on the conflict or just generally depictions of suffering presently, since societies will not be receptive to it. Additionally, that you do not have perfect information on the types of events that had transpired within that particular period. Second is additional responses to OO. They say that there isn't much to bring these communities together, but I don't know why, right? Like, conflicts happen for reasons outside of cultural unity or similar identifiers that teach you that you are a group of people with similarities. African tribes had cultures that are shared with one another, where they exchange practices, art, and things that are traded with one another to cooperate to form societies. It is just likely under opposition that the conflict was due to a conflict for resources that would then be aided by art on unity, because it shows you that you ought to share these particular resources and care about people regardless of your minute differences within interests, because your interests can align. But B, notably, opposition doesn't tell you why you as a potentially traumatized person with your own pain and sufferings are going to find peace in depicting dead bodies, depicting depressing scenes, since your day-to-day life for so long has already been a world where you were suffering. You already have seen dead people around you all the time. It is bad, therefore, for you to spend additional time illustrating your nightmares so that you can continue having those particular nightmares and never move on from your particular experiences. And notably, this also limits your capacity to be able to develop art past your trauma, because you feel as if it is harder to see past pain and suffering, therefore limit the type of creative freedom that you are able to express. Before that, I'll take Yalkun or Cavan.
The argument about how the oppressors can be making the art kind of cuts both ways, because if the oppressor creates unifying art, then they will create a unifying image that favors the majority race in your country.
If that's the case, we would still rather prefer that, because at the end of it, the principle is that you are still pushing that you are a group of people that need to galvanize together, that there are similarities, regardless if you are an oppressor or a victim, that you should look towards within the development of your state, rather than depictions of people being either in the right or in the wrong in terms of killing people, in terms of people suffering, therefore being the fault of the other person. We think this is better. Finally, why are we debate winning? What we prove is that it is infinitely beneficial for the artist to pursue art depicting unity and peace for three comparative reasons that benefit the artist. The first is that it is already in line with what you should do as a post-conflict state, which is to move on, which means under our side of the house, your art is likely to include depictions of both sides coming together and creating peace agreements. Art that illustrates that your youths banding together and forming friendships can happen, that racial harmony, where it shows that everyone is equal, happens. This means your art is likely to cater to the social narrative around you, therefore will be supported by governments and will be depicted in schools and will be supported by their parents but to their children and so on. But second, that you have your own particular motivations. You care about things like legacy and inspiration, and this depends on the reception of whether people support you. So you as an artist definitely care about your art being carried forward. If your art is contradictory not only to the governments in your society, but the people within your society and the types of messaging they want to push through their kids and future generation, then governments will continue acts of suppression that prevent both you and future artists from producing art in the future. So even if you believe that the artist feels a sense of justice and wants to create art that depicts the conflict in a way that benefits people, you as the artist will think in your head about how there are definitely going to be some parents that are not going to want to show their kids your art when you show dead bodies. There are definitely going to be some groups of people that are going to be traumatized by these particular depictions. Even if this isn't within the super majority, this is still a consideration in your head. Therefore, you will think about schools not wanting to depict your grotesque art. And finally, you have your own economic pressures, therefore care about your art being disseminated. You need to pay for food and earn a living wage, and you likely have people around you that you want to support. If you care like opposition needs you to, you need money to support charities or your local communities. For these reasons, we show you that is in line with the selfish incentives of the artist as well as the general society when you produce art that is about, unity, love, peace. We win.
I think DPM for that speech. Not to end the case for opening opposition, let's have Yellow. You're here.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yep.
Cool. Sorry if I look slightly sleep deprived. I unfortunately have not sleeping at all in the past day, but I will like just say stuff in the speech regardless. Cool. I'll start in like 3 seconds. So Soumitra going DLO, he, him pronouns. Regarding POIs, if I want to take one, I'll just say unmute. And you can go ahead and unmute at that time. And I'll take you. Please don't unmute yourself if I don't ask you to. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about 3 things broadly in the speech. First thing is in terms of artistic expression and satisfaction. Second thing is in terms of the value of feeling like your work is important. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is in terms of societal catharsis in general. I think the first thing here is in terms of artistic expression and satisfaction. Number one, the most important thing here is the ability to talk about your lived experiences. And the thing is that this is probably the most proximate thing for people to depict via art. I think as an individual, you can see the trauma that people have gone through. And yes, you probably do want to make people around you feel better, as OG says. But creating art in a way that denies the problems that these people faced in the past inherently makes it so that people don't acknowledge that these problems existed in the first place. So yes, you want to create change. You want people to feel good. But denying this trauma that happened in the past is not necessarily the way to go about doing that. And creating a false sense of security via this picture of unity is inherently denying the lived experiences that a large chunk of these people have faced. I don't know why all of a sudden people around you are going to feel better at a point in time you just depict art that is just hugely different from the actual perspectives of these individuals, which is likely to be true given the context of the state. Moving on is something that's important, yes, but it's also important to acknowledge what happened because you learn from these experiences. And that's what you depict through art when you show these visceral images, when you make paintings, when you write lots of stories and stuff like that in general, right? Because that's why you had art and talking and denoting the suffering of like Jewish people in post-World War II Germany, because that was something that was huge and impacted people belonging to this community. You wanted this community to be safe. You wanted this community to be welcome, and you wanted people to like acknowledge the fact that something happened in the past. It's ridiculous to say that people living in post-World War II Germany wanted a picture of unity being posted when they inherently condemned and destroyed the lives of so many people. We think that those people's experiences are something that is extremely important. Second thing to consider is the quality of the art pieces that you're likely to create. I think the idea is simple. If you buy the idea that you want art to be about lived experiences, it's also intuitive that this art will likely be of higher quality, increasing the satisfaction that you get from this art as an artist. Why is this likely to be true? Because you're able to talk about things that you actually know about. Again, art in our world isn't just talking about dead people, like talking about dead people or like depicting dead bodies. Don't believe what OG says here. It's about talking about what protests happened. It's about talking about the lived experiences, the huge problems that were faced by your community. And those are things that you saw in the past. Even if you weren't a member of that community, you can still see what happened, right? Like even like people who were like in the Nazi party in Germany in World War II knew what was happening on the ground. Like even if you're a bad actor and someone who has malicious intent, you still know what's going on around you, which is why the idea is that since you know exactly what you're talking about, because these lived experiences are something that are proximate to you, the art that you end up creating is something that's likely to be of higher quality. And I'm going to impact this out later, right? But the third thing to consider here is the multidimensional nature of art. Art is something that's subjective for individuals, yes, but the idea is that you're able to convey the sort of concepts or predefined notions that you have when you're able to create these pieces of art. And we tell you that art about struggles is important here. Why? It highlights the specific nature of the sort of oppression faced by people living in the state. OG says these accounts are likely to be extremely biased. I mean, even pushes on unity are likely to be extremely biased. They are only going to be biased in the worst way possible in their world, insofar as they're going to deny the trauma that people have faced and deny the idea that lots of people have been exploited in the past. We think that's just like a bad thing even in and of itself. The ability to depict the multidimensional nature of the protests going on, the multidimensional nature of the suffering that people have faced is something that's important to get people to talk about this in good ways. And this is going to tie back, all going to tie back to why your legacy is something that's like to be better preserved on our side. The fourth thing to consider here is the idea from OG that the person who creates this art might be part of the oppressing community. If that's the case, they still have biases. When an artist from an oppressor group creates an art about unity, it's like trying to delegitimize people who are oppressed. And in that particular context, it's just much worse for that form of art, because it basically just looks like propaganda messaging that seeks to deny the problems that people face. And this illustrates why OG's response here is like, this framing here is just like slightly insufficient. We think that the way in which we get change, or the way in which we get people to talk about our art, is when we issue something that's just highly contrarian in nature. The idea is that the most famous pieces of art is the sort of art that depicts the lived experiences of individuals and shows them overcoming barriers, shows them overcoming things that are extremely difficult to overcome. And like unity might be the grand goal of it, yes, but it's not something that's easily attainable. And we think that the only way you can get people to talk about your art is when you talk about something that they can actually understand and relate to overall. The second broad thing I want to talk about is the value of feeling like your work is important. I want to note that the governments in general want to push unity in these countries. The reasoning for this is what OG tells you. You want to unlearn harms. What OG says is that when you do this, you reopen wounds. But I think it's important to consider the value of contrarian art in these circumstances. Having a counter narrative that shows that the suffering was real, that the protests against oppression were justified, is something that is likely to be important for individuals. And the problem is this: OG says that the wounds here are fresh in the minds of people. We agree. The idea is that you still need to talk about these harms. It's not just about inspiring hope. It's about figuring out how to get society to engage with your art in a way that's meaningful in any sort of way, because that's what gives you any sort of validation and satisfaction as an artist. The idea that your artwork shapes people's views and got them to talk about things they feel uncomfortable talking about. And talking about these issues is important, because what happens in Gov's world is this idea of forgetting this trauma ever happened. Not having it depicted as individuals sets the idea that maybe this wasn't as bad as like history textbooks say, because like history textbooks write about this stuff, but when we see the visceral depictions via art, that's when people actually realize how fucking bad that thing was. So yes, people may be uncomfortable discussing this art at times, but that's the only way you can counter the predominant narratives regarding unity that the government is likely to push. Having the existence of different perspectives is what generates discourse, which is why your art becomes more popular in general. But I think it's important to note here that a government push regarding censorship isn't going to be effective in this debate, because artworks that have been censored have been seen to have profound impacts on society and perceptions that people have. I.e., books like 1984 were banned, but they served as a counter narrative that existed in the Cold War in terms of values like communism and capitalism. And this is important. It's crucial for people to be able to interact with situations that they may not be completely comfortable with, because this serves as a platform for any sort of discourse regarding your art, regarding what your art is actually trying to convey, that the suffering that people faced was valid, that it was one that was very bad and lots of people suffered as a result of this. Art depicting unity fails to accomplish this, because it firstly looks just like government propaganda that seeks to deny the existence of trauma that people have faced in order to get them to move on. But secondarily, it just looks like acknowledging that people were oppressed and that this is something that we ought to talk about, and you only get that on our side of the house. That itself is something that wins the debate for opening opposition, because the largest impact in the round, the ability to spur change and feel like your work is something that mattered, even if you don't get big change at all. The idea is simple. The ability to have the freedom to talk about the horrible state that the artist lived in is something that's crucial for weighing this out. If they are censored, they create controversy and become famous, which is good from the perspective of the artist, because they gain much more popularity compared to what they have in status quo. But if they don't get censored, then just the fact that they're contrarian pushes for more narratives that challenge the ideas that exist in status quo. The last thing to talk about is societal catharsis, right? Again, it's unclear what your preferences are as an artist specifically. It's highly speculative. No team can argue exactly how an artist feels regarding societal change. The artist is not all likely to be very woke. We can assume he has a fair amount of empathy and he maybe cares about society. But here's why what OG proves bites them in the foot. They said that this sort of art is something that is against the pre-existing narratives that exist in society, and hence people won't buy this art at all. But OG says that people can react negatively to art in our world. That's equally likely in their world. You can't guarantee what individual perspectives are. Your legacy is likely to be created based on how detached you are to the current era and how well you talk about these experiences. And the illusion of security that you create in their world doesn't illustrate these perspectives. We only get that when we have contrarian art, which is what opening op proposes. For these reasons,
We think opening DLO for that speech, not the open the closing half. Start with MG. You're here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, awesome. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The unique way in which CG is going to enter this debate is to talk about the utility of art. On the first level, I think as like opening houses both agree, art is meant to express and communicate experiences and emotions and perspective. But on the second level, however, and this is how we're going to enter, the utility is useful in its best form when it's used to express experiences and emotions that are unintuitive yet instinctual. The kind of things are at the back of your mind, but it's difficult for you to articulate. Similar to a good debate speech, right? A good piece of art should be something that when people witness, they know they cannot replicate. They don't know why it makes them feel the way that they do, but they intuitively understand what it means to them and they're able to make sense out of it. The reason for this is because it gives them a fresh perspective. It brings out something deep in the consciousness that they're not able to explore because of lack of expressional finesse. you as the artist have this unique ability to help people with this because you understand what expression means through your years of experiences and your craft. What this means is then the question becomes, do people need your help more with internalizing suffering, or is it the case that they need your help more with internalized aspiration? I'm going to give you 2 reasons why people do not need your help with internalizing suffering. The first reason is that this is literally their life experiences on majority of what they know the world to be. So they've lived through the conflict, they're likely still in the very bad position from the post-war situation of the country, and therefore they know, they can see suffering, they've experienced it with their own mind. If it's the case that I know my parents were killed during the conflict, I don't know to what extent can your art value add to this. On the second level, it's not exclusive, right? Because there's media involved. On the first level, you have journalism, so you have your BBC and your CNN coming down to tell stories about the conflict, to make it so that people are aware about what's going on and the pain and suffering that's involved. And do know, I think these kind of stories are more likely to be coming out from these agencies because they're a little bit more sensational and people are more curious about it, and therefore awareness on these things are going to be there already. On the second level, you have social media, right? So people already have ability to post about their life experiences in a very relatable way. What that means is that I think in general, people are able to come to terms with what their suffering is like and how do they come out of it. And therefore, your help is not super needed. In the case in which they want to run censorship, I think if this is the case that they censor all these avenues, it's unlikely to be the case that your art also sees the light of day. Okay, now I'm going to give you 2 reasons why people need help with internalizing unity and aspiration. The first reason is that it's just very, very hard to imagine. These people have not seen it before. They don't know what it looks like. And therefore, in you being able to give them an image that they can construct with their own previous understanding of reality, they can much better see for themselves what togetherness, past this conflict can look like. But on the second level, and more importantly, the people who are already communicating unity are likely to be the people who are doing so on a very non-relatable way. And I think this differentiates me from the rest of opening houses. The reason for this is because oftentimes there are state actors engaging in propaganda. There are 2 reasons why these things don't really work for the people who need the most. The first reason is because of credibility and self-interest. So as the correctly pointed out, if it's the case that I can see self-interest in this actor trying to promote unity, automatically I tune it out a little bit more, even if it's the case as something that's useful for me and my development and that's good for the country. On the second reason is that it's very unnuanced and assertive, right? So it's actually the same kind of art that Oji talks about, the kumbaya thing, where you just depict people being together from different races, and it's just very assertive in your eye, in the same way that your politics election propaganda looks like. But I don't think that's the kind of art that we have to defend. So I think the kind of art that we can produce in CG are going to be a lot more nuanced, are going to be a lot more open to interpretation. And because of the artists, we are able to do this. So for example, you can use abstract art, you can use cubism, you can use anthropomorphic characters, for example, to depict it in a way in which people can then take the context away from what the government wants and use it to positive it in their mind. So maybe it's the case that I don't have to have everyone in the country together, but it's important enough that I can just pick out the people who I think are worthy or important enough for me to move past my previous experiences of conflict and harm and resentment and aspire to working and building a better place for these people. I know that what's the angle from CEO already, so they're gonna say this art is most of the time co-opted by majority. Do note that my illustration of what this art looks like already tells you that it's not likely to be co-opted by majority. But on the second level, the fear of unity being co-opted by the government should not be a barrier to people feeling better and getting hope. I don't think that makes sense, right? So these 2 things are separate. And to the extent in which you as an artist are able to combat this, I think we should do that. The impacts of this are twofold. At the first level, you are able to give people something that they can move forward with, something they can understand, give them meaning and direction so that they can move into this post-war conflict era with more purposes in trying to find their place in it. But on the second level, I think more importantly, you enable them to be constructive and receptive to nation building, even if it's the case that they are distrustful of the new regime. So obviously, trust and resentment is going to be a big issue, but to the extent in which we tell people it's not about that, and that is not something to stop you from building this nation that you love, then we get a lot more utility of these people, get more constructive actions of them. They're much more likely to, for example, communicate with other people and talk and help them move past the previous resentment. They're more likely to pay taxes, more likely to comply with the government, more likely to participate in potentially any infrastructure of democracy. And from then on, it's the case where the government and the state gets better. I'll take one from CEO.
If you're a racial minority that is oppressed and excluded, why will seeing an art of unity suddenly magically feel like unity is possible and not realize that your lived experience don't
So the answer to this question is you don't, right? But that's not the bar that we're trying to clear. This is the bar that OG is trying to clear. They fail, they fall, right? On our side of the house, we think as an artist, you need to produce art that depicts aspiration. A person minority might look at this art and internalize it as, okay, the nation doesn't have to come together. but the people in my community can come together, or people in related and adjacent communities who have lent help to my community can come together, and we can create that own sphere, and that sphere is important. So it's something that's unique on outside the house. On your side of the house, we only have suffering, which doesn't lead to any constructive impact. On outside of the house, we do not let the fear of being co-opted into majoritarian narrative to be something that deprives these people, the people in the minority, the people who need to feel hope and dreams and aspiration in trying to make the community better. And I think that's something that's unique to CG. Okay, trade-offs. Why we need to forego all of the benefits of portraying suffering? First reason, exclusivity. So there's already material on suffering in terms of media journalism. There's already material on aspiration in terms of government propaganda. I don't think either OO or OG really explains why the art is exclusive from these other sources. It's only in my speech where I give you the unique way in which we come into play and we differentiate ourselves from everyone else. On the second level, on the second reason, constructive action and utility. So I think it's just more useful for people to feel aspiration and hope rather than for them to understand and internalize and have their feelings validated. Because if the average person, you say, oh, okay, suffering, I don't know what's the concrete impact of this, but if it's the case that you're on the fence and you have to so-called repress your feelings of resentment and suffering, but in doing so, you engage more in constructive actions for nation building, I think that's something that's good. On the third level, accessibility. So OO concedes that the art of suffering is going to be censored, and that automatically means the impact is going to be mitigated. Furthermore, the people who have access to this art are likely to be people who do not need your help, so that you're privileged, educated, intelligentsia who have access to black market art. They say 1984, but like 1984 doesn't exist in the country where the book needs to be read, right? So I think that's something that we circumvent. Our art is more accessible for people. More people are going to get utility and help out of this. For all these reasons, please start with CG.
Thank you for that speech. Now to open up the case for closing opposition, let's have MO.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, you're audible.
Hypothetically speaking, there's a dictator called Long Long Tacos whose family previously imposed martial law into country X 30 years ago. The legacies of plunder and of murder and of death is something that lives in the survivors and or their abandoned daughters and sons, something that is still very strong within the people's mind. As an artist motivated by state building art and who's potentially lived through the time, it is important as a reminder, not just now, but of future population. I'm going to do three things in my speech. The first is what is the motivation of this artist post-conflict? The second is what does art look like that seeks unity, which is not something that anyone has talked about. And thirdly, what does art that depicts suffering look like and why that's better in terms of national unity? Now, before that, I just want to clarify one very clear thing, which is what exactly does art look like that depicts suffering? Because the entire opening half seems to suggest that this art looks like something that's gory, like gore punk, that's full of blood and all these things. But we don't think that's true. The reality looks more like queuing for food rations, queuing for rice, and doing all these things or being under the line of fire, for example, are things that we think we can empathize or we can understand to be previous ongoing suffering that currently exists, of oppression, of things like that, of police arresting people, for instance, are things that can be empathized or can be depicted as previous or ongoing suffering, for instance. So three things. Number one, what is the motivation of art post-conflict? I think this motion suggests that the distributing of art that seeks to make something about state building or something that motivates the particular state, for instance. And the reason is because there's a dichotomy between the motion, which is just do you create art that's especially for unity and inspiration or ongoing suffering? They suggest that they want to understand, or because they have witnessed the horrors of war and want to understand how exactly you go about reminding the audience, for example. So when OG says that they don't want art that makes people uncomfortable, they completely miss the point of this debate, because this debate is about making people uncomfortable to the point that you can figure out what exactly do you do with your own state, what exactly do you do when you are reminded of this particular horrors of war to begin with, that helps to enable us to do more, for instance. Because all art is uncomfortable to somebody in post-conflict societies. Why is the audience likely to be receptive to this particular thing? In two reasons. Number one, the assumption coming from the entire debate so far is that these are monolithic human beings who have no opinions and no fault lines and no histories altogether. But that's not true. And art is only possible to be communicated to someone when there's a history behind that person, for example. So in a post-conflict state, what's likely to happen is that this person are traumatized human beings who want to look at art in the perspective of what they've lived through, for instance. And we think that therefore, a lot of the extension or the arguments coming from government bench about how that unites people, how that's going to help people, is not going to be true unless they can look past the image of unity and suggest that the state of the state of the country is so peaceful now that they can therefore see unity. They cannot explain to us why that's going to be a benefit to begin with, and we think that's problematic for them. Secondly, what is the nature of art and with unity and inspiration? Because that's something that we want to talk a little bit about. Because OO was right about sanitized art, but I don't think they actually explain how that sanitized art will come to be. I think the nature of this particular sanitized art comes in two different natures. The first is that because there are existing fault lines within this particular countries, for example. So even in Rwanda, we see like the Hutus and Tutsis who still continue to have some fault lines and some misunderstandings, despite 30 years of or 20 years of the ongoing war or the Tutsi massacre to begin with. So there's a lack of social compact, there's artificial portrayal of harmony that's sanitized and doesn't play well in terms of the art. For example, when the way that Singapore does racial harmony, right, is to talk about the CMIO model within art, for instance, which means that they make all of races in Singapore to be Chinese, Malay, Indian, or others, which kind of sanitizes a lot of other problems for minorities, for example, the Hindus, for example, the Hakka, the Hokkien, the Cantonese, and the Malayalis, for example, which means in the pursuit of a unity, you kind of like wash away a lot of the struggles of other people or the minorities within that particular state, which is more likely to lead to even worse concerns by the majority who don't understand or don't see the problems to begin with. And we think that those things are problematic. But more importantly, you also erase or ignore existing struggles, right? Because they don't actually think about how exactly these people came to be, how exactly they've come despite the situations of war to begin with, and all these things are quite bad. CG says that you can introduce Pol Pot as some cube or an animal, but we don't think that there's any value to that to begin with, because the idea here is that we want to imagine a world where the ideas of suffering are so visceral to the point where people are reminded of the fact that these are very real realities that have been lived in the past, and we don't want to revisit that in the future. And we think that that's kind of a reminder that we think is important. CG's other argument is to suggest that, we can do this in journalism, but obviously journalism is different in the medium that's being communicated, which means that if journalism can be used to do everything, then after that, obviously nobody goes to the museum. But the point here is the museum or all these different mediums of art serves as a purpose for us to remind ourselves of what our lives look like, not just in words, but in actual images that makes us understand the history that we lived in. So thirdly, and I think this is the comparison here, what does art that depicts suffering look like? We think the way we can depict suffering is an image that looks like, number one, visceral reminders of our past and what we have done. So for example, within this particular Singapore, for example, we can talk about Hockley bus riots, or within the context of Philippines or Malaysia, for example, we can talk about the instances of how there's martial law that's being imposed in the past, and how protest art helps people aspire to better state in the future rather than compared to what we can aspire to. Because honestly, if you are in a state where there's obviously going to be conflict and obviously going to be fault lines, it is hard to aspire to something more, considering the state that currently exists is kind of bad to begin with. And we think as a result, what we think is important is to therefore remind ourselves of what we have done. And the reason that is important is because so that audience can therefore react positively to that image or to that thing, to say that the fate of our future lies in our own hands. That's not something that we think that inspirational art can do. And the reason that inspirational art cannot do this is because it's something that's difficult to, sorry, I forgot the PY, but yeah, it's something that creates visceral metaphor for that. But secondly, also we think that the idea of agency is important. Because aspirational art is something that's imagined, we think that creates problems that we cannot reflect upon the histories that we come from, or the histories that we used to be from to begin with. And we think that if that is the case, that we cannot reflect or we cannot think about how far we have come as a state, irrespective of what the government has done for us, we think that therefore we will forget how bad it was in the past, how difficult our lives were, and what our parents have to suffer through in order for us to live our lives today. With that, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now to conclude CG's case, let's have.
Can I be heard?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay, give me a second to set up my stuff. You go. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want you to imagine yourself living in a post-conflict state. At the point in which you wake up, you go around, all you see is abandoned buildings, destroyed like infrastructure, potholes on the ground, graves around you. If this is the imagery that you see on a daily basis, there's no need to produce more art that depicts suffering, because your life, your eyes are already a visceral reminder of suffering on the ground. I need to say that the majority of whatever opening opposition and closing opposition talks about is already present in the visceral images that you see at your everyday life. Notice that this is already set up by Thanh, which Yao Kun misses out, which is why CEO largely is out of this debate. Because in order for them to accrue their kinds of benefits about inspiring people through looking at the suffering of individuals, that only happens insofar as people have an actual imagery of what success and progress necessarily looks like to themselves. But at the point in which everything around them is destitute, at the point in which suffering is everyday present in their lives, they have no imagery of what exactly is a successful life or a good life or a state that is able to succeed in and for himself. At the point where that happens, the only way in which we are able to empower individuals and people living in a society is through the mechanism that Thanh tells you, inspiring people through subliminal messages that art necessarily produces. But notice that there's a fundamental problem in this debate, which is that no team has an actual fucking comparative in this debate, right? Because an argument is only valuable insofar as it can be compared to something. The problem with opening half is that their argument is only really valuable insofar as they prove that you are the only artist in this post-conflict state, that your one piece of art can make a very big impact influencing everybody's lives around you. Note that this is uncomparative insofar as there are other artists that also live in post-conflict states that are likely to produce art that one, support the state about unity and inspirational messages, but also two, talk shit about the state and talk about the suffering of individuals on the ground. Therefore, the opening half clash is entirely uncomparative insofar as they don't prove that you are the only artist that exists. Do note the contrast that comes out is what Thanh tells you. The comparative is, he gives you two comparatives to compare his arguments to. The first comparative is that there's no need to depict suffering already insofar as suffering already exists within the visceral memories of these individuals. Therefore, the best way to inspire individuals or to give them an alternative is through art in which we can produce subliminal messages through things like abstract art that causes people to think and actually feel that they themselves came up with these kinds of ideas about inspiration and unity. But the second comparative that Thanh gives you, which I think is far more important, is that in comparison to the kinds of art that are produced by the state, inspirational art that produces by the state oftentimes are art that is very forceful. They forces individuals to look at the images. Think of, for examples, American flags that are being pasted all around the city or landscape or whatever. These kinds of art only do so much into make people not very happy at the point when they look at this kind of art. It doesn't inspire individuals insofar as they feel that the messages of unity is being forced onto them. This is why this particular actor is particularly important insofar as the kind of art that they produce necessarily inspires individuals from the inside. It makes them feel that they are coming out with this own, it allows them to internalize messages of unity and inspiration from the individual perspective themselves rather than the message being forced onto them. This is the actual comparative in this debate. And therefore, at the point in which we are the only thing that gives you actual comparatives, we think that we really take it over every other bench. I'm not going to go into more detail about opening opposition, opening government to just reinforce the fact that we're taking it over them. Notice that there's one fundamental problem with opening government. There are a few issues with opening government. The first thing is that they tell you that artists need to get money, they need to get money, and therefore we should talk about the selfish motivations of the artists. This clash is just not true, right? Because as an artist in the post-conflict state, everyone living around you is destitute. The point in which the kind of profit you get from selling your art is extremely small because not a lot of people can buy the kinds of art that you're trying to make. So you make art and you're trying to sell art on the market. What happens then is you have to sell art at very cheap price because people can't buy, or you have to or you don't get to sell your art. If it's the case that only rich people can buy your art, then you don't get the kinds of subliminal message, the kinds of impacts that that OG was talking about as well. But notice that this is fundamentally problematic because if you're selling your art to private collectors or individuals who want to buy your art, then your kind of art remains in their homes, right? It means in their own private galleries which is to say that these kinds of arts don't go towards like don't get shown towards the public. You don't get the kinds of impacts of like inspiration and unity that OG talks about. Therefore, this principal tension really affects opening government's case. But more importantly, right, is that if it's a case that is going, but more importantly, this means that like the selfish motivations of the artists cannot be a factor within this debate in and of itself. Therefore, we have to look at towards like things about unity and inspiration. But even then, there are fundamental problems within opening government's case. Insofar as they tell you that you can send messages of a brighter future, and that people are more receptive at the point when it's bigger market, they don't really tell you why or how in which you're able to inspire other individuals. Notice that it's only Thanh that actually tells you how in which this happens through subliminal messages of trying to make people own self internalize notions of inspiration and unity in and of itself. Opening opposition then. So opening opposition tells us a few things. They tell us that like you get counter-narrative push against the government. Sure.
There are artists that also are singers. FIFA World Cup already sings about all unity. Why don't you just go ahead and create things about like pain and suffering?
Sorry, can you repeat the first half?
There's other artists also. It's not just about painters. Like FIFA World Cup, people like literally sing about unity and togetherness. Anyway, why don't you just sing about pain and suffering?
But we are talking about abstract art. That's the unique mechanism coming from Thanh. I don't understand your POI. So really put to you that if the art is going to be coercive, if like, let's say, if the state is going to suppress your own like lived experiences, erase the lived experiences of other communities, they're going to censor your art. Therefore, your art is going to be forced into the black market. So the impacts of opening opposition is actually already very small. But notice that they don't prove tipping point. If the government is suppressing lived experiences, it's unclear how effective your art is as a counter-narrative towards the kinds of things that the government is already trying to do. But lastly, the problem with the entirety of Op Bench in general, with CEO trying to be a bit sneaky, is that we give them a problem. We give them a solution through art. They say the problem exists, but they don't give you any solution as to how in which you're able to allow the country to move forward. All they say is that we want to fight back against like narratives from the state. But it's unclear how do you create unity and inspiration for individuals within a post-conflict state in and of itself. Note that they don't provide any form of counterfactual or any ways in which they actually can solve the problem that we provided at the start of this debate. This is why opening opposition cannot win this debate. By extension, closing opposition also cannot win given that the context of their debate takes place in non-post-conflict states, insofar as people don't have the ability to feel inspired in and of itself. At the end of the debate, we are willing to make trade-offs of making some individuals and some communities unhappy if they interpret this as supporting majoritarian politics. But the way in which we are able to prevent like ease tensions, make people come together is far more important and far more important in the context of a post-conflict state where people have been fighting all the way through their lives. For these reasons, only closing government.
Thanks so much for that speech. Now, to finally conclude the round, let's have close opposition web here.
Hello. Give me a moment. Where's my water? Oh. Yeah, can I have my POIs in chat, please? Opening government starts this debate by having a stance, which is that they are against all art that makes people uncomfortable. And I was a bit shocked and confused when I heard this. So I had to ask a POI again to confirm. And they said, yes, they are against all art that makes people uncomfortable. The first thing I want to point out is that it's unclear why victims will be uncomfortable. Many of these victims have the genocides they experienced wiped from history books and media. This is true for the reasons that opening government themselves provide. The ruling government wants to create the appearance of harmony and therefore censors or downplays the suffering of some of these groups in their history books. Therefore, for these groups, what they want to see is their genocide being validated and being portrayed so that they know they actually went through it. They know that it cannot be denied. And so it's not the case that they will immediately react with discomfort. It's likely that they'll react feeling as if they've been seen or represented in the medium of art. But I posit to you that these victims have been historically silenced and therefore want to feel represented. The response they said was that they experience a lot of suffering on a daily basis and therefore they don't want to see pictures of dead bodies. This seems to be like an issue with the execution of the art, right? They don't like the art is very gory. It's not a problem with art about suffering in general. There are many ways in which we can create art that depicts suffering without showing broken buildings and dead bodies. A good example of this, so you have a better idea, is the painting that the Black Lives Matter movement did of Breonna Taylor, which didn't paint her like dead. it painted her lying in a bed of sunflowers, which also portrays the suffering that the African Americans feel under police brutality without having to be gory or without having to be something that makes people feel very triggered. But the second thing that Yao Kun told you is that discomfort is a good thing, because when oppressors and the racial majority who consume this art reflect on the status quo, this discomfort is actually a representation of the cognitive dissonance they feel when they start questioning their worldview and they realize the historical trauma that's been inflicted onto racial minorities. So discomfort isn't a bad thing, it's representation of this causing political discourse and causing the racial majority to reflect. But I also want to prove, by opening his government's own metric of discomfort, they lose this debate. Because Yao Kun told you that unifying art is idealistic, because it imagines harmony that does not exist. The Bosnians and Serbs don't get along. Their children go to different schools. The Tutsis and Hutus, when they know that their grandparents were killed by the opposing side. This therefore imagines harmony and unity that currently doesn't exist. The art is therefore going to simplify and generalize the undeniable tensions in the country, and this is going to make people feel discomfort when they know that this other racial group dislikes them and excludes them, but they see in art that they are all getting along. This is going to be causing them some form of discomfort. That's why by OG's own metric of discomfort, they also lose this debate. The next thing the opening government says is that there's no fiat that you're the oppressor or the victim. We agree. If you're the oppressor, you will have no historical trauma or suffering to portray. But in most cases, there are victims on both sides because violence hurts everyone. And therefore, it's about the shared societal experience about living during civil instability, which all groups can relate to. But we further flip this argument because we told you that it cuts both ways. If an oppressor creates art based on unity, it will uphold their idea and subjective view of what national identity looks like. This means that they will push their version of history, push their cultural values, and push their practices and symbols that are related to their ethnic identity and not unity that's good for everyone. I think that it's very idealistic that the government bench thinks that their idea of unity would somehow include all of the different racial groups because this artist is so inclusive. This means that, I want you to think, right? Like if you're an artist in post-conflict Burma, you're not going to portray Burmese art that includes all the Rohingyas and Shans and Kayins. You're going to have a Burmese-centric idea of unity. This achieves the counterproductive outcome because the art doesn't actually unify people, but it excludes racial minorities and making them feel disengaged from the state when they see art that glosses over the differences and the tensions and the trauma they feel. Now that we've taken out opening government, I want to weigh above opening opposition. The first thing the opening opposition does is that they misrepresent opening government because they persistently say that opening government is trying to forget history. We uniquely explain that suffering and oppression is often censored in the media space, and therefore art is a unique and exclusive medium to talk about these stories, and therefore we prove that not having art about suffering is the equivalent, politically speaking, to forgetting it because it's one of the only mediums in which critique about history can exist. The second thing that opening opposition runs is that they run catharsis, but the reason as to why we take it above opening opposition is because opening opposition thinks catharsis is the impact when it's actually the mechanism in this debate. We told you that when people get catharsis and closure, this is when they feel like they can move on and they can focus on nation building. Otherwise, they'll be consumed by historical grievances and injustice. This is why we are logically prior to all of the other houses in this debate, because all houses want harmony, but we provided the roadmap for resolving current grievances, which is the prerequisite for people to engage in state building. Before people can dream of unity and harmony, they must first be able to sleep at night. And we told you that this suffering desperately needs to be resolved in terms of representation through art. The reason is because Yao Kun told you that the trauma is recent in the case of Rwanda or Bosnia, or is currently ongoing like in the cases of Ethiopia or Libya. People who are feeling these cultural traumas fresh in their memory want to feel like someone is hearing their stories and not wanting to feel like they're being ignored by history. But the second reason as to why we cannot ignore differences and just randomly imagine unity is because differences are institutionalized. Look at Lebanon's power sharing agreement. Look at Bosnia's rotating presidential system. You can't just create art about Bosnians and Serbs getting along when the literal constitution of Bosnia like institutionalized that there are different groups that dislike one another. Therefore, in order for us to move forward, we first must resolve the past. Let's bring in closing government. The first thing that closing government says, or before that, I'll take a POI from opening government.
So oppressive artists will push art that erases history when it's about peace, but when they produce art about the conflict, it somehow won't be about their dead soldiers being harmed by your evil minority. Why,
Even in that case where they're talking about their dead soldiers, this is probably a trauma that they also feel, and it's probably good that they resolve this because this feeling that your soldiers were killed by the other side doesn't magically go away on your side either, and there's some need to have political discourse about it. Now let's bring in closing government. The first thing that closing government says is that they can use other avenues to talk about suffering like journalism. Yes, we will run censorship. Post-conflict states are unstable and limit journalism. Look at Hungary, look at China, which aren't post-conflict states, but still limit journalism in their country anyways. But we also pointed out to you that this cuts both ways because because if journalism can be used to solve everything, then why can't you use journalism to portray unity as well? But the most important analysis that Yao Kun gave you was this ignores the unique potential that the medium of art has. Seeing a news article about genocide is very different from seeing a painting that's able to visually move you and convey emotion. And the reason is simple. Trauma exists not just politically, but in the cultural memory of people, and it cannot be resolved in just words. It must be reflected in our culture as well. The next thing that they say is that it helps people imagine unity. The first, if they look around them and all they see is suffering and discrimination, this piece of art will be unrelatable to them and cause cognitive dissonance, which means that they don't feel inspired in any way. They feel as if tensions are simplified and this is not the current world that's being represented. But even if they are momentarily inspired, they still feel oppressed and excluded, and so their inspiration dies quickly. But the last thing is that unity and harmony is a sensitive thing, and it's unclear why an artist will be able to portray good kinds of unity when they're also subject to internal biases and might end up replicating state propaganda. The common government push is that they see suffering all around them and therefore don't want to see anymore. But I want to respond to this in intuition, which is that the Black Lives Matter movement currently creates art about racial inequality, and they don't portray whites and blacks getting along. Instead, they portray the suffering that African Americans feel on a daily basis. For all these reasons, extremely proud to oppose.